With the US and Iran facing off, the war in Ukraine continuing to rage, and the threat of global apocalypse knocking at the door, it feels like World War III could break out at any moment. But would anyone actually survive? Well, if you're from one of these countries, congrats! You might just be the last to go in the nuclear fallout. We'll explain why on today's episode of The Infographic Show: countries that are impossible to invade in 2025. Iran. Iran has long been seen as the West's enemy, and if you are a newly minted 18-year-old with a patriotic itch, well, guess what? Uncle Sam might be planning another Middle East vacation. But before we dive into why invading Iran would be a terrible idea, let's break down why tensions are rising. It all started in the 1950s with America's Atoms for Peace program, which brought nuclear power to nations friendly to the US. It was a pragmatic form of foreign aid, the type of thing that builds soft power so you can avoid having to use hard power. Iran got aid in developing nuclear power for civilian use, and the US got a friend who promised to never ever pursue nuclear power of the type that makes new suns appear over cities. In the 1970s, there were plans to build nuclear power plants in Iran, but then in 1979, Iran was overrun by religious extremists, the kind that very much preferred the type of nuclear power that makes new suns appear over cities. And that meant that the West in general got pretty nervous about the idea of Iran getting nuclear weapons. Sanctions have historically been used to tamper down Iran's nuclear ambitions, but those same sanctions also helped fuel Tehran's anti-US narrative. After watching the US steamroll Iraq in Desert Storm without even breaking a sweat, Iran and just about every other rogue regime suddenly realized that if they didn't want American democracy in their backyard, they needed nukes, the only weapon that could keep out freedom and capitalism. In the mid-2010s, a deal was brokered to create an inspection process to ensure Iran was incapable of reaching weapons-grade enrichment before military action could be taken against them. However, in 2018, the US withdrew from that agreement. By 2025, it attempted to re-enter negotiations, hoping to restore or renegotiate the terms, a move that no doubt gave the Ayatollah emotional whiplash. Naturally, Iran refused to resume talks. Aside from an Israeli-led operation targeting Iran in June 2025, there's been little in the way of direct military intervention on Iranian soil. Beyond limited operations by special forces and intelligence units, neither the US nor Israel has committed to a full ground invasion, and for good reason. Iran is kind of impossible to invade. Okay, well, maybe not impossible, but invading Iran would be a very stupid thing to do. First, you've got Iran's geography. The easiest invasion routes into Iran are all over land, and they have to go through some pretty defensible mountain passes. The US has actually wargamed that scenario over the last 2 decades, and each time, the logistical challenge was so great that it was deemed worst-case scenario option only. The moment forces push inside Iran, defenders could use the geography to wage a bitter campaign of attrition. And while US firepower is unmatched, recent conflicts like Ukraine have shown how modern drone warfare can level the playing field, making any invasion costly and drawn out. An amphibious invasion might sound more realistic, but it comes with its own nightmare scenario. Invasion forces would be met by a dense arsenal of short-range missiles. Iran has them in high quantities, and unlike its longer-range systems, these don't need complex infrastructure to launch. But even when the troops take a beach, they'll have to push into Iran itself to secure victory, and that is where they'll immediately run into problems. Iran is absolutely covered with mountains. The entire country is basically just a mess of crisscrossing mountain chains. Sure, invading troops could probably take the southern shore of Iran, but then you better hope your troops have been hitting the PT extra hard, because it is literally an uphill climb. Now it appears in modern times that the majority of Iranians are either ambivalent to the regime or directly opposed to it. But with over 90 million people, you're still stuck with millions of Iranians who are probably happy to die for the Ayatollah, and they have just got so many caves and mountain hideaways to launch attacks from. Invading Iran would turn into a second Afghanistan for the US, but with a significantly more capable and well-equipped insurgency to deal with. Just ask Alexander the Great. His forces might have conquered Iran, but holding it was another story. He quickly found himself facing constant revolts and the brutal reality of mountain warfare. Enforcing your will on people who can basically just hike to the other side of the mountain from you and rain arrows down if you try to follow made occupation a logistical nightmare. Or you could ask Saddam Hussein, who invaded Iran in 1980 and expected a quick victory given the significantly greater forces at his disposal. Very quickly, Iraq's tanks hit the western mountains, and the thousands of dug-in troops flinging RPGs down at them In over 8 years of fighting, Saddam managed to conquer exactly 0 of Iran's territory. Next up, invading this country means taking on an entire continent, Australia. It's the land down under, and it is impossible to invade. On January 26, 1788, a British fleet landed at what would one day become Sydney Cove. They looked around at a continent full of poisonous insects, poisonous reptiles, poisonous mammals, poisonous fish, and poisonous plants, and then thought, yeah, literally love everything about this place. This is home now. It took 1901 for some Australians to officially launch an independence movement by uniting the colonies into the Commonwealth of Australia under its own constitution. Not one to rush things though, Australia took its time on that whole independence thing, with the country gaining its full independence in 1986 with the passage of the Australia Acts, severing the last link with the United Kingdom. During World War II, Australia faced its darkest hour. The Japanese bombed Darwin in a show of force meant to intimidate the country. The Japanese severely underestimated the people who grew up with every animal and insect either trying to kill them or cause them cripplingly painful injuries. But brave as Australians might have been, they were located in an area that, according to Allied military planners of the time, was, quote, far away from everything. Australia's closest ally, the United States, was 6,000 miles away, and the UK, which was supposed to be protecting it, was literally on the other side of the planet. And yet, that is kind of what saved Australia from invasion. From the southern tip of Japan to northern Australia, it's about 4,000 miles, and that is a hell of a distance for an invasion force and resupply fleets that would be needed to keep them in fighting shape. Meanwhile, the Australian and American navies and air forces could wreak havoc on big convoys of troops, food, ammo, and fuel that the invasion would need constant replenishment of. Even if the Japanese managed to land, they literally had an entire continent to conquer. Sure, the most important bits are all along the coast, but even those are pretty far from each other. Modern technology hasn't changed that situation much. Firepower is more mobile than ever, and planes can sortie out from further distances than ever before. But Australia remains far away from everything and at a low risk of ever being invaded, especially with the signing of the AUKUS Pact, which will soon see Australia using American-designed nuclear attack submarines, a move that threatened China so much it loudly protested on the international stage the moment it was announced. And if you want to invade this next country, you better get used to having dysentery and a million jungle diseases. Brazil. If you're a world power considering invading Brazil, you'd better rethink those plans because it's impossible to invade. First, let's talk geography. Brazil's inland borders feature almost completely impenetrable jungles, and the western border is so impossible to invade that the nation doesn't even bother with any sort of border walls, fencing, or protection at all. Its southern borders are more built up, presenting a much easier proposition, but the roads leading to the north cross water features and canyons every few miles, making them easy to destroy and thus stop an invasion force in its tracks. Anyone trying to move to the political heart of Brazil would basically have to rebuild an entire highway on the move and under fire across hundreds of miles of rainforest terrain. An amphibious invasion is a much better route, granting access to the all-important Brazilian coastline, where the economic and political heart of Brazil lies. But there's a few problems with that option: the distance and the Brazilian military itself. Brazil is closer to major world powers than Australia, but still thousands of miles away. If you want to know how vulnerable even big world powers are to the tyranny of distance, you only need to look at the Falklands War. If Argentina would have gotten a lucky missile attack off on a single British supply vessel, the entire war would have gone the other way around. Then there's the Brazilian military, which is a regional powerhouse. It is the second strongest in the Americas after the United States, and it's ranked 11 in the Global Firepower Index. This is due to a robust navy and a well-equipped army. Brazil's air force is its weakest point, and it would struggle against an invader backed up by aircraft carriers. But the Brazilian Navy's 6 frigates, 2 corvettes, and 4 submarines would launch hit-and-run attacks on invaders' supply lines. The army, meanwhile, could easily defend the beachheads with its stock of nearly 300 tanks and hundreds of artillery. It would take the capabilities of a superpower like the United States to successfully invade Brazil, but then they would face a very different inland trek to root out an insurgency that would grow explosively. Hiding in the jungles, Brazilian insurgents could bleed any invasion force to death, while severing road links that connect the coast and thus bottling up the invaders. The sheer logistics of invasion simply make one impossible in 2025. Our next country was almost invaded by Hitler, but even he was smart enough to know it just wasn't worth the bother. Switzerland. Its army is only 150,000 strong and it only has 200 tanks. Yet Switzerland is physically impossible to invade. Famous for its neutrality, Switzerland sits in the beating heart of Europe, historically a pretty bad place if you value peace. And yet, despite sitting on the border of the most war-prone nations on Earth throughout history, Switzerland has never been invaded, technically. The French did venture across the Alps in 1798, but they were practically invited in to overthrow the old government. It's no mean feat sitting on the border between Germany and France and having been spared both world wars, and yet Switzerland managed the impossible, though only because they caught Hitler on a good day. Earlier in the war, when everything was springtime for Hitler, he considered sending the mighty Wehrmacht in. However, one look at a topographic map, and Hitler was quickly convinced that yes, while it could be done, it simply wouldn't be worth the trouble. If you grew up in Switzerland, you would think God hated anything flat. Any approach into Switzerland is uphill, and it's easily defended by even this nation's small garrison. An exchange ratio of even a modest 3-to-1 would still mean that Switzerland's force of 205 tanks would destroy 615 of the enemy's own, a figure that very few nations can actually stomach. Even major powers like the US and China would find themselves so exhausted by the effort that it just wouldn't be worth it. The strategic and economic gain is also simply not worth it. Switzerland's high level of national wealth means that it doesn't skimp on its military either. Its inventory is made up of modern Leopard 2 main battle tanks, with even the old variants showing their ferocity against Russian tanks. CV-90 armored vehicles built in conjunction with Sweden provide protected firepower for its infantry. In the skies, the Swiss operate a fleet of F-18 Hornets, one of the few not operated by the US. 36 F-35s are currently on order, and both operate out of hardened mountain shelters that are impossible to destroy with a preemptive strike. Small but very modern, and with the most defensible terrain on the planet, Switzerland is a country that is simply impossible to invade. And even if you tried, you would have to fight your way through multiple allied nations to get to it. Ostensibly neutral, Switzerland nonetheless enjoys strong partnerships with its western neighbors and the US. Trying to take out Switzerland means having to fight with basically the top 10 global militaries that aren't Russia or China. Our next country is impossible to invade, and, well, it's a no-brainer. United States. When you're talking about countries impossible to invade, the United States takes the top of the list every time, to no one's surprise. The US is basically the luckiest country on Earth. Already resource-rich from coal to oil to copper and natural gas, the Russians decided to make the Americans even stronger by selling them Alaska for practically a penny. In modern times, Russia's realized the foolishness of that deal, and some have argued that Alaska should be retaken by force because the deal was with the old Russian czars, not with the modern Russian Federation. Nobody has officially tried to reinforce Russia's alleged claim to Alaska, and there is quite a few reasons for that. The first is America's geographic position on the world map. Not only does it sit right between East and West, it's basically untouchable due to two massive oceans. The secret to the US military is its mobility. With about 1,000 transport aircraft and more amphibious assault capability than almost the entire world combined, the US military is the only military on the planet that can fight anywhere on the planet at any time. That's not by accident either. Because the US is so extremely geographically unassailable, early on in the Cold War, American military planners realized that if they wanted to influence global affairs, they needed to cross the same divide that separated them from any enemies. So the US invested heavily into the world's strongest navy with the world's biggest logistics backbone. But what about China and Russia? Surely those two massive militaries could reach the US? For years, Russia has been engaged in a special military operation with a nation a fraction of its size and on its own border, so that safely rules them out. But what about China, who now has more naval vessels than even the US? Well, China is a strong contender if their population bomb doesn't implode their economy as it's predicted to. However, the nation faces two big problems. It currently has 2 operational carriers with another on sea trials and a 4th under construction, but none of them are built for extended missions far from home. Chinese surface action groups have only recently begun leaving local waters, but China's logistics fleet still isn't strong enough to support protracted and distant operations. Their 2 carriers with a combined fleet of around 60 or so combat aircraft simply can't bring enough firepower to match the almost 2,000 fighter aircraft in the US inventory. And even if they could, China just can't move that many troops far from its own shores. The People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, has been building many new amphibious combat ships, and even dictated that civilian ferries must be capable of handling military traffic. But these are short-range craft. When it comes to military supplies, China only operates about 12 resupply vessels, and these are smaller than their American counterparts, of which the US has over 24. In between them and the West Coast is a US Navy made up of 81 destroyers, 11 supercarriers, 9 light carriers, 26 corvettes, and 70 submarines. And unlike their Chinese counterparts, these are all combat-tested and veteran platforms. Then they would have to face two of the largest air forces in the world, the US Air Force and the US Navy's Air Force. But even if China somehow made it all the way across the Pacific, the real war would be just beginning. The US homeland isn't just protected by distance and oceans, it is guarded by layered defenses, terrain, a sprawling, fortified interior, decentralized command, and hardened logistics. So the bottom line is that the US is still completely impossible to invade in 2025. While some nations are practically fortresses, others might as well be rolling out the red carpet for invaders. Watch countries easiest to invade and see who is surrendering before the first shot is fired. Or check out this video instead.